133 BC marked the end of the Numantine War. By itself, it's a pretty insignificant bit of Roman history, and I'm not going to get into it too much, but just think of an ancient Vietnam situation. But what's interesting is that it got together a bunch of big names in Roman history. The leader of the campaign was Scipio Aemilianus, the guy who beat Carthage for the last time. Earlier in the war, Tiberius Gracchus, the great reformer, negotiated the escape of an entire surrounded army. Most importantly for us, present at the end of the war were Gaius Marius and Jugurtha of Numidia. Jugurtha fought for Rome in this war, but he'd be bitter enemies with Marius later on. Jugurtha was the nephew of the king of Numidia, a man named Micipsa. Ever since the Second Punic War, they had been allied to Rome, and they produced some of the best cavalry in the Mediterranean. They were so good the Romans started using them as auxiliary units in its own army. When things came to a head, this cavalry would be a constant thorn on Rome's side. From birth, Jugurtha kind of won the genetic lottery. He was popular, smart, and strong, but on top of that, he was also related to Micipsa, which meant he was a potential heir to the throne. All this made him a nightmare for the king, who wanted his own sons to inherit Numidia, so he did what he did back in the day. He sent Jugurtha off to fight in some war and crossed his fingers that he'd be killed in battle. The war happened to be in Numantia, where he served under Scipio Aemilianus, a close friend of Micipsa. There Jugurtha learned all he could about the Roman military. For Rome, your military and political careers were one and the same, and Jugurtha quickly learned the weaknesses of both. He was especially delighted to discover that upper-class Roman society functioned on bribes and was rotten with corruption. Aemilianus was very pleased with how Jugurtha was catching on, but was also wary of his fascination with Roman corruption. After the war, he sent Jugurtha home with a letter of his glowing praise, but also a piece of ominous advice about bribery. It is dangerous to buy from a few what belong to the many. It was advice that Jugurtha would never heed. Micipsa's plan had backfired. Now, his sons didn't just have a rival, they had a rival that had connections with influential Romans, some of which Jugurtha had given large amounts of money. He was backed into a corner, so rather than angering Jugurtha's new allies, he decided to lean into it, adopting Jugurtha. This wouldn't be a permanent solution, but Micipsa really had no other choice. Jugurtha had become too powerful for even the king to deal with. Micipsa would die in 118 BC, leaving the problem of Jugurtha unsolved, only making the three sons promise that they would treat each other as family. The three heirs played nice, at least at first. Jugurtha agreed with the two other sons, Heimsal and Adherbal, to divide the kingdom and the treasury into three parts. But the uneasy peace was broken. Jugurtha had his soldiers bribe Heimsal's bodyguards. They got into his house and killed him. Before Jugurtha could take out Adherbal as well, he found out about Heimsal and quickly raised an army. But Jugurtha again had the upper hand, since the men Adherbal was trying to recruit had already served under Jugurtha in Numantia. His army was laughable compared to Jugurtha's, and was crushed. Adherbal managed to get away, fleeing to Rome. He appealed to the Senate to try and get his kingdom back. After an investigation, the Romans decided to split the country in two. Adherbal would receive the coast, and Jugurtha would get the inland pastures. This decision was made thanks to Jugurtha's usual assets. Many of the senators in Rome remembered how capable he was in Numantia, and many others who would have taken Adherbal's side suddenly discovered large sacks of money just lying on their doorsteps. The settlement left both Numidians tense, but nothing really happened until 113 BC. When Jugurtha did what siblings did best, he tried to provoke the other one into violence. He began sending raiding parties into Adherbal's territory, but Adherbal also decided to take a page out of the sibling playbook, tattletale. He sent a letter to the Roman Senate saying that Jugurtha was violating the agreement Rome had passed down to them, and requested assistance. The Senate was tired of dealing with the two brothers, and was also currently getting tossed around by some Danish migrants up in the Alps. As soon as Jugurtha heard that he'd have free reign in Numidia, he launched a full-scale invasion, destroying Adherbal's army and bottling him up in the capital. Now the Romans were interested, and sent a commission to make another settlement. During the negotiations, Adherbal's Italian advisors urged him to surrender to Jugurtha, and follow whatever ruling the Senate passed down. When he did, Jugurtha immediately had him imprisoned and tortured to death, then sent troops to the city, where a number of Italian merchants were killed. This sent Rome into an uproar. Even before the massacre, public opinion was starting to turn on Jugurtha and his bribed senators, so the Senate assigned the consul for 112 to the province of Africa to raise legions. This genuinely surprised Jugurtha, so he doubled down and sent his friends to Rome with even more money for any senator willing to listen to him. Before they made it, they were barred from entering the city and were sent home. When the consul arrived in Numidia, Jugurtha himself showed up to negotiate. None of the men present wanted a drawn-out war, so they struck a deal. And by deal, I mean a gift of elephants, cattle, horses, silver, all wrapped in a big bow that says, "Sorry we killed those guys." In return, the Romans packed up and left. The reaction to this settlement was not great. The public was outraged, and the Senate sent someone to fetch Jugurtha so he could testify to the Senate. I'm not really sure what the Senate expected at this point, because when Jugurtha arrived at the city, he found an unscrupulous tribune named Bebius. Tribunes have a unique power in the Roman legal system. Any one of them can single-handedly veto any proceeding, and there was no way of overturning it. In my opinion, it's one of the most broken aspects of the Republic, and Jugurtha took full advantage of it. The crowd waited for Jugurtha to speak, but instead Bebius stepped forward and vetoed the entire hearing. The city was furious, but Jugurtha was already planning his next move. He dispatched his friend Bomilcar to get rid of some potential claimants to the Numidian throne, namely some distant relatives of Micipsa. When Bomilcar arranged the assassination of a grandson of Micipsa, it was discovered that Bomilcar was responsible. And though the heir was killed, Bomilcar was apprehended. Before his trial, Jugurtha broke him out of prison, and he escaped the city. I imagine Jugurtha being Jugurtha spread some money around to make this happen. In retaliation, Rome decided that Jugurtha had to go, and ordered him to leave the city. Jugurtha was pleased. He had been summoned to Rome to submit, but instead he had outmaneuvered the Senate again, and even tied up some loose ends while he was there. On the way out of the city, he famously turned on his horse and said, "A city for sale, and doomed to speedy destruction if it finds a purchaser." Jugurtha had consistently played the Romans at their own game and won, but this time he'd gone too far. His exposition of the corruption in Rome was humiliating and insulting, neither of which are emotions Romans handle very well. He'd pay the price later.